And I, for whatever reason, was suddenly so angry at this man who's from Libya, who's such a bad man, and oh, he's done this and that, right? And so a narrative was pushed about who Muammar Gaddafi was. And let me just get my notes so I can read these things.
Hello and welcome back to Sòrò, sókè. This is a podcast created to learn, understand, and demystify life in Africa and African lives. And today we're joined by two beautiful women, and I'm so like happy, excited to record this episode. But today we're going into developing our African identity, but essentially we're talking about identity. And I came across and kind of thought about this idea from actually listening to the Ubunifu podcast, which I will link in the description below. They had an episode on the word understanding development, two-part series. I really recommend listening in, and it just got me thinking. And I just had to kind of talk to them and get their viewpoint and just be a bit selfish and just like ask them, be in the conversation with them, right? So okay, let me kind of get them introduce themselves, and then we can get into the conversation. So we have Wacera M, and then also Wacera Thande. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Wacera Muriuki. I am a history fanatic. I guess I studied international development in uni, but I am incredibly interested in how contemporary issues that we have today are rooted in historical context and how we can find solutions to these problems by looking into the context. So, yeah, super excited to be here. I like social history, so I'm excited to talk about identity.
Awesome. So I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Wacera Thande. I'm a social worker by profession. That's what I studied in uni, but I've also done social development. So my interests are in like social policy, understanding development. Similar to Washara, I do like the historical context, but I'm more so like um I guess more present time type of things because I like working in social policy and doing social research. Yeah, so that's my background.
Thank you so much. And for the listeners, yes, they both have the same first name, but I'll be referring to one a surname and then the other one just Wacera. But yes, just keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Okay, so right, I've mentioned that I actually came across this topic, and a little bit I wanted to delve into for what it means to be African. So that's kind of like the point and the crevice of kind of this conversation and what we're going to get into it. But I came across this idea from listening to Bashara Thande's episode on the understanding development. And in that episode, they really delved into what does it mean to be labeled as a developing country or a third world country. Um, let's quickly dive into that, and then we're gonna go into essentially the larger size, how it affects nations, and then into how it actually affects individuals. So, can you just give us a little bit of an clearer picture or better understanding of what does it mean when a nation, or how did it start when a nation is labeled as developing or third world country? What's the impact? How did it start? Let's kind of delve into that word.
I think in my how I understand this, sorry, is the terms developing and developed, third world and first world, um, even global north and global south came from the idea of, or rather from the place of modernization theory. And modernization theory is the idea that countries develop according to a specific pattern, right? And so you start, and this is again modeled on the European experience of development, right? So you start on the ground, like imagine it like a plane. You start on the ground where you are savage and you are very background in your social and economic policies and your political practices. And then you slowly, as you get rid of some of these things, slowly climb up like a plane, and finally you're in the air and you're flying and you have very specific policies in place. And so you are developed. And so countries that are still on the ground, right, who have specific social practices, cultural practices, political practices still in place, right, are considered developing or are on the ground, underdeveloped, undeveloped. And countries that are slowly getting rid of these things now are just starting to climb, right? And so this is, you'd see this as NICs, or newly industrialized countries, countries that are just getting um, modernized, quote unquote. And then countries that are in the air are those who have huge industries, who have, I mean, yes, the Western world. And so it's a way of categorization. Those who have made it, who are the standard, those who are reaching towards the standard, and those who are just not there yet. And so it's again based on the European standard of, or experience of development, and everyone is put there and said, okay, this is the standard. If you don't meet it, then you are underdeveloped, you are getting there, or you are like us. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually, I feel like Muriuki explained it perfectly. I think one thing I'll just emphasize is how arbitrary it is, because it's like there's already a set standard, which is the European standard, and then everybody else falls under it. So it ignores the complexities of different countries, cultures, the histories of different countries. Even that whole idea of like the global north, global south, it creates like a hierarchy in your head where the global north is above and the global south is below. Even the first world versus the third world, even like the types of wording that we use, just it preempts someone who's more advanced than everyone else. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I usually say it reinforces especially racial stereotypes of how Africans are seen a specific way versus Europeans or other people from other countries. It's just very interesting. I feel like the wording is very intentional, and people just be like, nah, that's just the way academics have decided to name these things. But no, it is very intentional. Because it's so arbitrary and there's already a set standard, then it reinforces those racial stereotypes that we feel as Africans. And going back to your question where you're saying what it makes us, like what we think development is, unfortunately, a lot of us will think about it from the European standards, from the standards that Wacera has said. But I feel like the more you study history, the more you start learning more about your culture and the society that you're in, that starts to shift a bit, because you realize, oh wait, this model is Eurocentric and so it's flawed. I can't use it to define my people because it's not centered on us. It's not Afrocentric.
Jumping there again, I think I really like what you said, that it really, in essence, disqualifies other pathways to development. It says that this is how development has to look. If you're not going this way, you're going the wrong way, you're not going to make it, right? And
And you're
it
not going to
disqualifies,
develop.
you're not going to develop. It disqualifies. And I think we talked about this on the podcast before. It's just like there are many ways. What's the word? There are many ways to skin. Oh no, that's such an awful saying. I won't say it.
So
But there are
anyways,
many
skin are
ways.
good.
Yeah, it's just there are many ways to reach a one goal, right? It's like what works for you doesn't have to work for me,
For everyone
because
else,
your
yeah.
context is different, your history is different, the way your
Yeah.
society works is different.
Can
But
I
if you
just, sorry to
Mhm.
cut you off. So just on that point, right? Someone might be listening to this and think, what's wrong with that categorization of countries and nations? Because if we look at it on a plain eyed, yes, the Western quote unquote are more developed and have better things, and statistically speaking, the people are richer in the country. They statistically speaking, the saddest country is actually in Africa and in a developing country, quote unquote. So the life expectancy is higher in the Western developed country because they've let off some things, and they're in the air, like you said, the flight. So maybe they do need to get rid of certain things to increase their the wealth in the country, the life expectancy, the rate of their happiness level, however you can measure that. How there's statistics that might back up the fact that, okay, to be developed is to be like this, which to their plain eye does make sense, right? Or what do you guys think to that?
Well, Okay. For that one, you've gone into in development. You call it like the Human Development Index. That's what they use to like measure people's happiness, satisfaction, and everything. Which is also
Mm-hmm.
it's also I would say it's a bit new because the way development was labeled, and I think we covered this in the podcast episode, which is there's modernization, neoliberalism, and well, all of those different things. So like it's a process that European countries have gone through, and then they expect the rest of the world to do. Sorry, let me backtrack a bit. So when you were saying like when you look at like the material realities of the way the Western world looks versus the rest of the world, yes, definitely. You can see with your own eyes. You have better transport systems, you have better healthcare systems, you have better infrastructure systems, like you have housing, better housing projects, you have better sanitation. Like those things are true. You do have those things. However, I'll always go back, even in the podcast episode, I said my definition for development is self-sustaining growth. And I feel like this is where the caveat comes in, where it's about, okay, so this Western country is developed, but how did they get to that point and how are they sustaining that development? For us as Africans, we are developing. What are the things that are stopping us from being developed? Are they purely organizational issues? Do we have weak institutions? Is it a matter of corruption? Is it a matter of policies that are keeping us there? There's so many things to think about. So like onto the naked eye, yes, you will see the Western world versus the rest of the world. Yes, they're two worlds apart. But like when you start looking at now, like at the policies, you start looking at the infrastructure, you start looking at the institutions, you start seeing different things, which now makes you start thinking, okay, then what is development, you know? And when you start asking that question, then you're able now to start looking at things from whether it's a racial lens perspective, so like looking at the racial hierarchies, or looking from a historical perspective.
Yeah. And I think I like exactly where you ended that. It's like it's not equal. And
Mm,
again, just like you said, it's so easy and we're almost trained to just see things at face value, but that's really not, it can't be what it is, because I think
mm,
you're looking at countries that force in some cases like they have never been colonized, right? They have
mm,
had their freedom for a very long time, and you're trying to put them on the same level as countries who are 50, 60, 70 years old. How?
old,
You
yeah,
know?
yeah.
And it's just like you have had centuries to figure out what works best for you in terms of policy, in terms of economics. I was reading English history the other day, and it's like you've gone through policies and laws that sound stupid, and you figured out that it didn't work for you, and so you corrected it, and you year by year, century by century, decade after decade, you have edited the way that your country works to figure out what works best for you. And then for countries like Kenya and other countries in Africa who had policies imposed on them, they were told this is the way to do it. If you don't do it this way, it's not right. And it's like this
Mm,
is, in terms of formal politics, I guess, this is all we have known. This is what we were told to do. It wasn't made to work for us. It was modeled on their nations and what worked for them, right? Um, and so it's almost, yes, these countries have higher happiness, they have, and it's true, it's like we can't argue with these things, and they have systems that work for their people and they're doing amazingly. But I don't think that necessarily right to take it out of its historical context and put us on the same level. We cannot, being 70 years old, compete with the people who made the game that we're all supposed to be playing. You know what I mean? You made the rules, you
and
made the game, you designed it,
and you've been
and
participating
we're
in it for like what, almost a millennium.
exactly. And then it's like Monopoly. You've already built the hotels, you everyone and we have just entered. We don't even have one property, but we're supposed to be able to pay for the hotel that you've built on Mayfair. And you know what I mean? So it's just it's I think that historical context is very important.
Okay, so we started kind of from a global perspective of the word developing. And what I want us to kind of do now is see how does the word developing, or if it does, if you agree that it does, how does it affect how we we view ourselves as Africans. I really want to delve into the word identity and how we carry ourselves as Africans throughout the world in other countries and in Africa. So my question is essentially, we've went from nations to individual level, right? Do you think that the word developing or our status quo of being a third world country affects how Africans view themselves?
Yes,
Yeah.
100%. I think I'd mentioned this in one of the other questions. So words shape our perceptions. That's something that language is a very like big tool that's used to shape perception. I'm just gonna throw in. This is why this is one of the reasons why I really really appreciate this author from Kenya called Ngoyi Wathiongo, because he champions using our own indigenous languages, and he's written this book called Decolonizing the Mind. I haven't read it, but if anybody wants to read it, I think I would highly suggest because he talks about it from like a language perspective, and why it's important to retain our own language. So yes, language is a very important tool. And as I was saying, like even the way we look at like the world in terms of global directions, the north, south, east, west. In our heads, north is up, south is down. If you look at the map, the global map, Africa is considered south, but like when you actually look at a globe, it's like smack in the middle of the earth. You know, it's not down. It's not where Australia is. But like it's those perceptions that we have of places and spaces that are shaped by the words that we use. So I will say definitely it does shape our own identity and how we see ourselves. And this is why I even brought in like critical race theory when I talked about how when we have an arbitrary way of looking at the world, it reinforces the racial stereotypes that we have, where there's like black versus white or like white versus people of color across the world, you know? So that's why I'm saying, so like already as Africans, we already have certain perceptions of ourselves that have been imposed on us because of slavery, because of colonialism, because of our very complex history. So we already have certain perceptions of ourselves. Then when you go into the developing world or the development world, when you're working in these spaces, trying to create these policies, you find already there's a binary. It's developed versus undeveloped. And when you look at yourself, you're in the underdeveloped part. Like you're always trying to catch up. You've never made it as an actor. So it definitely does have a perception on your own identity. And another thing is like our African identities are so complex. You have Africans on the continent, you have Africans in the diaspora, then you have Africans in the Caribbean, you have Africans in the States. So many different historical perspectives, so many complex identities. And then, yeah, it's just, I usually say it's a hot mess that can be gathered and created into something that's like digestible, but it's very complex. Yeah, that's my long answer.
I think just so my brain remembers, the question is, does the terminology affect us in terms of identity, right?
Yes. How does the word develop in a third world country kind of affect us?
Okay.
And if you think it does or doesn't, essentially.
Okay. So I think I'll answer this from the point of dependency theory. And dependency theory was championed by Latin American intellectuals in, I think it was the 1970s. And they argued that the development of the Western world, or rather the development of the core, right, of the global north, required the underdevelopment of the developing world. The development, I'll say that in different terms, the development of the center, let's call it the center, requires the underdevelopment of the periphery, which is the global south. And so he was just saying how, and you can think of this in terms, because it was written in the age of decolonization, that colonized countries had to remain stay at a certain level of underdevelopment in order for former colonizers to continue to benefit from them, right? And so it's the argument that you have to stay at a place where I can continue to exploit you so that I can continue to benefit from you. And that makes sense in the age of colonization. And so you can think of that in terms of colonization. It's very black and white. It's like, yes, we have to stay colonized, we have to stay poor so that our colonizers can continue to benefit from us. But when you look at us now in the time of corporations who are actually doing the work of economic exploitation, right? And we all know of like offshoring, how I'm going to move my operations to a poorer country where I don't have to pay my laborers as much, where the environmental laws aren't as robust as here. I am actively benefiting from the underdevelopment of this nation so that my profits can look very, very nice at the end of the year, right? And so the question comes in, right? How is it possible to do this if we don't if to maintain these systems, right? Unless the people of that nation are of a certain mindset, are of a certain identity, right? You have to have, because um again, how do I say this? It's a very economic on the surface, but if we go deeper, we would appreciate that it requires a very specific type of person to accept to be treated in this way, right? A specific society to allow the environment to be polluted to the extent that
Like
the
this.
company potentially could. It has to be a people that are convinced that they have no viable alternative, that this is the only way to get a salary, that this is the only way to retain foreign investment, and a people who will believe that this is the only way to develop. Um, and so if it's your physical labor that is valuable on the global market, strategically, I will keep you in this place through government policies or whatever. But at an identity level, who do I have to convince you that you are? Right? What cap do I have to put in your mind that you believe you only have specific value because of, or how do I say this? I have to convince you that who do I have to convince you that you are, and what cap do I have to put in your mind on the value that you have intrinsically, but on the value that you are able to offer? I have to condition you to believe that you are a specific type of person with a specific value, and this is all you can offer in the world. Do not expect more. Do not challenge it. Don't challenge the status quo. Stay where you are because this is all you can offer. And so I think in terms in the context of the world economic system, right? The global south occupies a very specific place, and it's not a pretty place. Trump was talking the other day of black jobs, right? And so you can see how I have to believe that I'm a certain type of person. I have to believe I have only specific things to offer to the world in order to stay where you need me to stay to make profit. And you can see this politically. You can see this with companies. If people start organizing in unions and saying, no, we want more money, we don't want you, we want to be given proper protection, we want you not to pollute our environment, the corporation can actually lobby the government and say, yo, handle your people because our profits are at risk, or we will leave, and the government will discipline the population to maintain profit for that company. And so do I believe that our identities have been conditioned, are affected, by the term developing and the economic system that it maintains? Yes, because you have to be a specific person in order to enable the system to continue working the way that it works. And I guess we'll get to this later on, but there are systems in place to discipline you if you think that you can be anything else but what we require you to be in the system.
Okay, that was so, I know, right? That was beautiful. That was both of you beautiful. So I want to ask a question, Wacera Thande. Right, so you mentioned about language and the importance of decolonizing our
Yes.
minds, right? So I wanted to kind of touch on the importance of language. By language, do you mean like the words that we use? So, for example, the word developing and third world country, or do you mean our native language? The importance of us being able to speak our native language.
I think it's a bit of both. So so initially I had said words shape our perspectives. Sorry, English. They
Big
shape our
words.
perspective. Yeah. They shape our perspective. And your my mom usually says this thing is, oh, Wacera, your world is as big as the languages you speak. And it's the whole idea of like, I speak my mother tongue, I have access to that history, that information, that's the societal structures of that place. I speak English, I have access to the English speaking world, the way that English speaking world speaks, its practices, its all of those things. So like, that whole idea of language is a tool that's used to help you, I feel like, enter a specific cultural space and also have perspectives from a cultural space. I think the best thing I can say is, like, for example, with African proverbs, trying to translate them into English, trouble. Because how am I going to explain to you a chicken and something and this makes sense? It would make sense to you as an Englishman, because you don't have the same environmental aspect and context as me as an African. So yeah, when I say language is very important, I mean both, because one, the issues that we have with English is that it's very reductive, because it only sets one perspective.
So do you, just on that point, do you think to be African or to be Kenyan
Mm-hmm.
is to know your native language, your native tongue?
No,
Okay.
because being African is so complex. Because you have Africans on the
Mm-hmm.
continent, you have people of African heritage from the Caribbean, you have people of African heritage from South America, from North America, and not all of them have access to their indigenous tongues, or like they've been so removed from the continent that even their indigenous tongues are no longer what they used to be. So I say it forms a part of the collective African identity, which again is very complex, very mixed. But it's not what it means to be African. I feel like also reducing your identity to your language is very reductive. So language is a very important tool, and I feel like we don't give enough credit to what language does, how it opens up doors, how it helps us perceive different ways of thinking and doing things in the world. Which goes back to the point where Muriuki had mentioned before about like the whole idea of development. There's no one way. I believe there's no one way of developing, but because of this developed versus developed binary, every country has to go through specific steps, like everyone else. Not like everyone, like the Western world, in order for them to become developed. But can you imagine if we had, like, let's say, a development studies school in West Africa which spoke Hausa, Yoruba, and I'll say Igbo. Those are the three languages I know from Nigeria. And you're here creating all of this intellectual information in your languages, you're creating all of these things. Definitely, development will not look the same way as it does, for example, in London. Because already you're using and expressing a different language that will bring in a different perspective.
Okay, so then, right, you've ended on the language perspective, right? So do you think, some people might say, like, right, this doesn't affect us right now anymore? It's been years, it's been decades, and anything that has happened to us Africans is by us Africans, right? I've heard this before, and someone said that anything that has happened to us, it's by us. And so essentially we are the Africans, so that our identity, right, or is being affected by our own actions. So my question is, why, and if you think it does still affect us too now, why is that? And what's your response on the people that say it happened so long ago that anything that does affect happen to us now is actually by our own doing rather than
Um,
anything
I
else,
get
right?
you. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. I think so I talked about dependency theory earlier. Another theory that came out of dependency theory was one called world systems theory by a man named Emmanuel Wallerstein. And he argued that um, and I'll quote, the capitalist world economy resulted from century-long expansion of a world market centered on Europe from the 15th century. That states' dependence on developed countries' manufactured goods was fostered while they were under imperial rule, and that these same relationships of dependence and exploitation live on in spite of countries' acclaimed independence. right? He argues that the same systems that operated all the way back from the age of discovery have transformed and become more palatable over time. And these are still the systems that run the world that we live in today. And so, in as much as they may not be all up in your face about, oh, colonialism and this and that, the systems are still working, right? It may be subtle, it may be, in Kenya we say chini ya maji, it's just like it's not in your face, it's under the water. But they are still very much functioning. I was reading a book called Testimonial. It's here. It says Canadian mining in the aftermath of genocide in Guatemala, right? Just like I said before, right now it's corporations that are doing a lot of these works, a lot of the work of exploitation, but their governments very much back them up, right? And you said those things happened ages ago, and it's Africans doing it to themselves. I'll give you an example of Muammar Gaddafi, and he's a very contentious figure. But Muammar Gaddafi was, as we may know, murdered during Obama's tenure as president, right? And I remember, and I think the reason I bring up this example is I remember it so vividly because I remember I was in year 8, and I, for whatever reason, was suddenly so angry at this man who's from Libya, who's such a bad man, and oh, he's done this and that, right? And so a narrative was pushed about who Muammar Gaddafi was. And let me just get my notes so I can read these things, right? He was an incredible visionary and pioneer. He had his flaws, right? But I remember reading how like their biggest resource was oil, and so his people were taken care of. You got married, you got money from the government. Every time that they got profits from their sale of oils, everyone, just like when I lived in Canada, you get some money in your account. You know what I mean? He was taking care of his people. His people were good. Like he took care of his people, right? And suddenly this man who is from Northern Africa says, hey, I see the resources on my continent. I recognize that if we pull together and have a collective identity, understanding the resources that have been given to us, we can pull ourselves out of poverty. We have enough hydroelectric energy in the Congo River alone to power the entire continent of Africa. And it's like, look at all our natural resources, all the gold, all the diamonds, all the da-da-da-da-da-da-da. We can use this to our benefit. And so he actually made a plan. He said, okay, guys, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this, and we are going to make a currency backed on our natural resources. Not long after he was murdered, right, in a huge drain pipe somewhere in his country. Completely shameful. And was that his fault? Why did NATO suddenly have such a huge interest in a country in the middle of Africa doing what it wants to do? Why was he such a threat? And so when people say, oh, we did it to ourselves, na, I question that, because that example in itself really illustrates that there are certain manifestations of identity that must be repressed in order for the global economic system to function the way that it has for centuries, right? Because in my thinking, there is identity, yes, but beliefs buttress our identity, right? And when we have these, for example, I am a Kenyan, objective truth, right? But because I am a Kenyan, I believe I have the right to benefit from the natural resources of my country. That's a belief. The manifestation of this belief is I will advocate and lobby and go to protest for certain laws, bills that are going to be passed in my nation, because I believe I deserve the best treatment because I am a Kenyan. You know what I mean? And so as long as the manifestations of my beliefs that are from my identity do not threaten you, it's cool, right? But again, another example. I'm thinking Patrice Lumumba and Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton was
Yeah.
21.
When he was assassinated, yeah.
He was 21 when he was assassinated, but he was so dangerously effective, right, in pushing others to see the beliefs of a new collective identity. And the manifestation of that was so threatening that he was murdered horribly. Ili iwe funzo. And that means so that it can be a lesson to everyone else
When else,
that
yeah.
this is a manifestation of identity that cannot be tolerated. Same with Patrice Lumumba. And yes, he was in the time of colonialism, but I think that it's an important thing to bring up, right? Because Patrice Lumumba, incredible visionary as well, and one of his core beliefs was former colonizers, because for Congo, and Congo is a huge conversation, we can talk about it a lot. Congo has incredible natural resources. And not only were the Belgians there, the Americans were there, the
Are still
French were
there.
there. Like, there were huge mining companies that were there. And he said, listen, all of you, we as a Congolese have the right to benefit from our own resources for the benefit of our people. Let us handle our own things. You guys can come back after. And he went around preaching this new belief system of a new identity. I hope you're following. He was trying to teach new beliefs to build a new collective identity within his people, and the manifestation of that would be safeguarding their resources for themselves. This was a manifestation of identity. This is what was a threat to all those that would come, like to the colonizing powers and the mining companies that wanted to benefit from the resources.
From them,
What happened to him? He was brutally murdered, and the illustration of his manifestation, let me just say it as it is, all his speeches were forcefully fed to him in front of everyone. He was paraded through the streets, beaten, and just completely ashamed in the streets, and then he was murdered. His body dissolved in acid.
And mind you, and the only remains he has of his body is a tooth, apparently.
My point here is, in as much as we can, and I guess the argument of, oh, Africans did it to themselves is very much connected to the slave trade, and we can talk about that another day. But when it comes to where the nation is, our continent is, and nations within the continent, when it comes to that, I don't think that we can say Africans did it to themselves, because corruption is one thing. But to see when your revolutionary leaders are brutally murdered and assassinated because they are advocating for the best of their nation, that's not our fault. Right? Because they are pushing for the manifestation of an identity that cannot be tolerated within the current economic world system. So I don't think that's their fault. I think it's very much, just like we've been saying, a result of how the world currently works in the interest of certain people's profit and power.
Sorry, Zainab, let me just say one thing to round that off. Which reminds me of this quote, and I always quote this quote. I think Wacera, you were there when I quoted it, where he's talking about like the colonial system, and he says, on the contrary, we must persuade ourselves that colonialism is incapable of procuring for colonized peoples the material conditions likely to make them forget their quest for their dignity. Once colonialism has understood where its social reform tactics would lead it, back come the old reflexes of adding police reinforcements, dispatching troops, and establishing a regime of terror better suited to its interests and its psychology. The premium examples I can give you right now is, like, for example, how Kenyan cops have been sent to Haiti. You're sending troops, sending reinforcements, you're establishing a regime of terror just so you can suit your interests and your psychology. And that's the interest and psychology of colonialism, which backs up Wacera's argument of what she was saying, that she gave the example of Patrice Lumumba, but literally every single revolutionary leader we've had in the continent has been killed. And it's not just simple assassinations. Fred Hampton, his house was literally shot up. You go and shoot up a 21-year-old man's house with no gun. Really? So, like, I just want to make it very clear to to our listeners is that we need to understand that as Africans, the cost of you standing up for your dignity is high. because it's not going to be given to you, because you're going to disrupt the status quo of the global system that has reinforced these identities that are there, and that's a big thing. So even something as simple as a black girl walking around secure in her African identity, that is an issue it's a threat to the global establishment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think just one more. You think of indigenous Americans, right? Some people say Native Americans, some people say First Nations. Um, their identity is in the land, and you'll hear a lot of times, "Give us back our land." However, very practically, and I say this because it's very, very practical. You give. They say, "This is our ancestral land. Give it back to us." Who lives there now? Are you going to chase them away? No. And so how can I repress you enough to maintain what I want to maintain at your cost? But again, that manifestation of identity, of your indigenous American identity, must be repressed so that I can keep what I have now. So just another illustration of what we're trying to say.
Okay. It's funny, Wacera, you mentioned about Congo and really understanding that. And I literally had an episode recording with Maurice, the co-founder of Friends of Morocco, regarding Congo like yesterday. So it will come out before this one. But so anyone that's interested, do listen to it. It's going to be it was such an insightful conversation as well. Very important. Um, but I want to go back to the core topic, which is on identity. And essentially, you have said that it has been impacted by a lot of the history, right? So I want to then ask you, what does it mean for you, each of you, right, to be African? Personally, what does it mean to you to be African, right? It's honestly a tough question, which I have asked a lot of my network, which the episode is coming out soon after this one. But because you've said that, it's been impacted by a lot external factors that you couldn't, like, right, you couldn't help but be impacted by. But the way you see yourself now, do you identify which factors have been impacted externally and which factors have been impacted by you being African internally first, let's say?
I'll say, as someone I'm born and raised on the continent, but I went abroad I was out for 5 years. And I will say one thing I remember coming across as a young kid, because I feel like even my upbringing in my own African home has been very Afrocentric. Like, my mom was very adamant. I never relaxed my hair. I always had my natural hair. Even the fact that I don't have an English name, like, is something she ensured that I don't have an English name. So, like, I've always had a strong African identity. But, like, I think one thing that I realized when I was younger is I found a quote by Kwame Nkrumah. I don't even know where this quote is from. I probably need to find out. But he basically says, "Oh, I'm not African because I was born African. I'm African because Africa was born in me." And for me, now as I get older, I start to understand it more because I also see it from an Ubuntu perspective. I recognize our interconnected nature as people of Africa. Given the fact that we all have interconnected struggles, we all have interconnected identities, we all have interconnected cultural practices. The fact that you can get hibiscus tea in East Africa, get it as zobo in West Africa, and get it as sorrel in the Caribbean, like, that's one thing that unites it all. So, like, the more I look at it, the more I look at our cultural practices, and I'm like, wow, truly, I'm not African because I was born in Africa. I'm African because Africa was born in me. Because there's a difference between me and an African Caribbean, but at the same time, there isn't. Like, our parents all use Dettol in the house to clean the house, like, so that's something that I've come to realize. So yeah, for me, being African is recognizing that I don't know, Africa isn't just the continent, it's the people, it's the culture, it's society, it's the spiritual practices, the music, it's everything about us. The good, the bad, the ugly, the historical, the painful history that we have, but then also the beautiful history of resistance that we have, as painful as it is as well. Yeah, so for me, my African identity has evolved from just being like, oh, I'm Wacera, I'm a Kenyan Kikuyu girl, my Kikuyu name, to being, oh, I'm Wacera. I've recognized myself in the global setting of African. And yeah, being African isn't just being about coming from the continent. Well, in the grand scheme of things, if you say it's coming from the continent, all of us, the whole world is from Africa, anthropologically. So yeah, that's my how I see my African identity.
I made a face when you asked because yeah, it's a very I don't think about that often. It's like wow, I really have to reflect on it. If I'm honest, I feel like my African identity feels very born of resistance. Because you probably heard people say, I didn't know I was black or African. No, I didn't know I was black until I came to America. I went to school in Canada. And so there is a part of my identity, of my Africanness, that was born of being in a different, like in a no in Canada. And I think because I mean, again, for me as well, born and raised on the continent, born and raised in Kenya. Um, and I am Kenyan. I am Kenyan. I became African when I went abroad, and I'm like, Kenya? Where's Kenya? You know what I mean? It's like, oh, I am African. I am African. And so you become the face of not only a country, but a continent. And so I feel like a lot of my becoming African has been in response to negative, because again, I'm very history minded. I love history. I read a lot of African history, read a lot on the slave trade as well. And so when I read about for example, what like the Tignon laws in the US, and how African women had to cover their hair, and then you hear all these conversations about, oh, your hair is so untidy, and having conversations even in school about how across the continent, and this was crazy to me, like in Southern Africa, in East Africa, in West Africa, how you had to have your hair had to look a certain way in order to be considered neat. And I'm like, oh my goodness, because of this historical context of repressing this African identity, I am going to grow my hair however I want it. You know what I mean? It's like in response to this repression in the historical past, I will then celebrate this part of myself. Does that make sense? And so I feel like discovering what it means to be African for me has very much been rooted in that place of learning and responding and appreciating certain aspects of who I am. But it's also very much in I guess in the same way, actually, seeing all the injustices that we have experienced as a continent and desiring better. And so I see myself as, yes, as a continent, we deserve better. Therefore, I will fight in whatever capacity I can for the continent. But I also we are so beautiful. Oh my goodness. What a joy, what a delight to be associated with such. You know what I mean? Because you go for like cultural days and stuff, and you're like, wow, you guys do the same thing. Your beads are so pretty. Well, so it's just, I guess, like I said before, it's a lot of learning and response for me, and in manifesting my identity, but also just the pure joy in experiencing the diversity of what the African continent has to offer. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that both. I think last question for me. So on this podcast, I say this all the time. What I want us to do is not just have conversations and talk about the potential, the status quo, but really delve into the action points. Okay, so kind of like what now? Okay, we've discussed this, and we've discussed how a language and history and corporation have really impacted and affected us, and how it's still affecting us to this day. So what now? Okay, what does that mean? What should I do? What is that action? What's the way forward?
Okay, I think like for me and Wacera, we're both like very, I don't want to say academic, but we love reading and finding out information. But the thing is that looks different from different people. For some people, they learn it through YouTube. They sit down and watch like 3 hours of YouTube documentaries. It's me personally, I can't. but I will read. So I would say, like, if you find something interesting, go research about it. Like, there's so many resources out there. Especially like when it comes to your own African identity. There's these sayings where, like, for example, if you look for something, you will find it, So I usually say, like, if you're struggling with your identity and you're trying to figure out the whole African scene, like you're someone of African heritage, but you don't know where you fit in, just go do some research and you will find yourself eventually. Another action point that I say is for the people who are like in between, where I'm like, I really don't know where I fit in all of this. I really like the way my life is right now, but I also want to support the African struggle for like liberation or things that are going on. Like, for example, what's happening in Congo, what's happening in Sudan. I'd say, yes, learn about it, but then support the people on the ground who are doing that work.
Yeah. I think I'd say, just because we are talking a lot about identity, ask questions. Start asking questions. Don't stop looking at things at surface level, right? Ask, like, what have you believed about yourself, about the continent, about yourself as a child of the continent, about the potential of the continent, about what is possible and what is inevitable for the continent. Yeah, ask questions, and then look at look at historical context as well. Let me not go into historical context, because people still think history has no value and can get easily bored by it. But then look at the economic world system, understand it to the best of your ability. Look at Africa's place within it and see, and I really hope people can begin to see the patterns, right? Why things are the way they are, why they must be maintained the way. And look and notice, that's the word, notice the systems that discipline people to stay the way they are. I think we'll all be better off once we see things the way that they are, because there is hope. I believe there's hope. So just ask questions, look for patterns, and notice. I think that's a beautiful place to start whatever this journey is on getting the continent and its children to a better place.
Thank you. Beautiful way. And just before you mentioned Wacera, you mentioned it on how your identity is a lot on based on sometimes on responding is very responsive. This quote came to mind of this book from James Baldwin, which actually I read like ages ago, and I just wanted to read. It says, I am what time, circumstances, history have made of me. Certainly, I am also much more than that. So are we all. Which I thought was very quite interesting, that as being African is not just the one thing, which are Thande you've mentioned. It's not just the language. It's not just the what you eat, the food. It's so complex and so broad, and there's so much to it. And honestly, we could take days talking about identity and specific African identity. We can really go into this in a lot of detail. But I think I think this conversation has really done it justice, and I think it's definitely a starting point, which follows on the action that you mentioned for people that are interested in this to go into and just take a step into it and just really look into it a little bit more. Notice, as Ashura has said. That was beautiful, and the next episode that will be coming out from this is going to be me asking my network what it means for them to be African. So it's going to be very interesting, so tune into that. Just on that point, I would definitely urge people to go listen to the Ubunifu podcast. Put it in the description and all the stuff, all the details on social media. But yeah, okay, fantastic. Thank you so much.